Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this solo video, it was 2014, and a bike taxi was driving down this remote road at night just outside of the city. And on either side of this remote road lay these crumbling, abandoned factories, little more than cinder block walls and crumbling metal roofs. This area had been a place of rumor for quite a long time at this point. Locals would speak about this place in hushed tones, about the disturbing things they heard that had been happening around here. That would become a horrifying reality for this driver when he heard screaming coming from these pitch black buildings on either side of this deserted road. When he began to tell people about this, at first they didn't believe him, but he was so adamant about what he had heard that night, and people had also become worried about, well, there had been reports of a lot of people gone missing around this time. They went out there to investigate. And what they found in these abandoned factories would be pure nightmare fuel. And one of the scariest things about this entire story is it didn't just happen here, it happened in a lot of other places. But before we get into it, please subscribe to see new stories for the dark every single week. Now, let's give it a go. It was on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2014 that a lot of folk were very fearful in the city called Ibadan. This is in southwestern Nigeria. Specifically, it was a group of men known as the Okada Boys. Ibadan is one of Nigeria's biggest and fastest growing cities. It truly has a lot going for it, and about 2.5 million people call it home these days. And in all of the major Nigerian cities located around, it's a very, very big country, are these little networks of bike taxis known as Okadas. Nigeria as a whole really is a country on the move, being one of the biggest economies on the continent, and Ibadan is a prime example of the country's growing, ultra-competitive hustle culture. These days, Ibadan attracts Nigerians from all around the country, as well as an ever-increasing number of Africans coming from both the north and the south of the continent to live and work. That means, therefore, that it's very competitive and thriving job market, so entry-level jobs can be very hard to get. So if you're just looking for work, simply, what's the easiest legal work to get? Probably being an Okada, getting this bike taxi to drive people all around the city. Okadas are usually teenagers or young men doing simple A to B runs around the city, kind of like short little hop jumps to wherever you need to get go. You jump on the back of the Okada and you're off. And for the sheer amount of Okadas, usually there's about 100 operating at any one time. They are a surprisingly, close-knit, really tight community. They really always look out for each other, they take care of each other, they meet up constantly, to let them know, oh hey, there's lots of fairs going on over here. Or maybe you should, avoid that part of town, it's not too safe right now. Everybody is known to everybody else, they meet up at regular intervals. If something was going on, they put it into the group chat if, something is up. And of course, with a lot of Nigerian law enforcement being kind of hit or miss at best, the Okada network is so tight because they really have to look out for each other, because they're not going to get any help or a whole lot of help outside of their own little community that they have created. So this kind of improvised union system, if you want to call it that, of Okada Boys, they will, play detective if one of the riders gets robbed, if one of the riders gets beaten up or threatened. They will all just join together to make sure that each one of them is safe. If there's any issues, these boys will, they'll take care of it themselves. They have their own justice system going on. You don't mess with the Okada Boys. But it was around this time in March of 2014 that they didn't really know how to solve what was happening. They were very fearful, they were very scared, and it seemed like they were all out of their depth. In March of 2014, rumors of suspicious disappearances had been rumbling between the Okadas for a few weeks. It all began when 2 riders seemingly vanished, which does happen from time to time. People do simply just drop off the radar. Usually they turn up shortly after in a holding cell or even a hospital room. Others have just left for opportunities elsewhere. But to just vanish, without a word, and then never reappear, that was concerning. That was always going to, get people's attention, especially if you were part of this extensive but close-knit community of Okadas. They wanted to make sure that each one of their guys was good. So after those first 2 riders vanished, the Okadas of Ibadan, they began to just, keep each other in the loop about what was happening. You know, they would report potential sightings to the other Okadas to just keep an eye out when you're driving through, you know, the myriad maze of streets and back alleys that make up this southwestern Nigerian city. And as is often the case with missing people from, you know, poorer communities, the police aren't kind of too eager to get themselves involved, so once again the Okadas were left by themselves. It seemed like a weird event, but hopefully they would just turn up and everything would be okay. But it was when a third rider went missing. That's when, you know, you think the police, who were, you know, they were trying to keep them in the loop, you think the police would be jumping out of their chairs at this point to get involved. You know, that three Okada riders have all disappeared in this very short space of time. But sadly, that was not to be the case. The police still did not care. And so it was left to their friends and to their colleagues to try and solve whatever weird stuff was going on in the city. It was getting scary now. But right in this third disappearance, they at least had a place to start. But the whole place to start thing kind of made it all more disturbing, to be honest with you, folks. On March 21st, 2014, a rider was just making his usual, you know, routes, driving his regular passengers around to their destinations when he suddenly started getting call after call after call from another Okada boy, a colleague of his named Lanre Sedeku. Lanre was asking, you know, can you please pick me up? The rider said, yeah, you know, I got a couple of jobs, I have to drive people here, here, and here, but as soon as I'm done, I'll swing around and come get you. But when he did, Lanre was nowhere to be found. He wasn't where he said he would be waiting for him. Lanre Sedeku was the third disappearance, and worse yet, when the rider, you know, went around, was messaging Lanre's friends and other people, you know, who he'd been in contact recently, nobody had seen Lanre. Nobody knew where he had gone. He had simply vanished. And so, my friends, speaking of hidden things in the creepiest of places, there are some people out there doing just that, but they ain't into, you know, witchcraft or some such. They're into you, tracking and finding you to do Lord knows what with that information. So it's important to remain untraceable, but how would one do thus? Well, one simple answer: you got to get the greatest VPN out there. That is NordVPN, who are sponsoring this whole video. Nord makes sure I'm not tracked because it hides my IP address. So rather than people being able to trace where I am on my computer, I can be instead anywhere in the world I want to be. So not only will no one be able to find out where my actual real location is, if I need to get into some data that's only accessible from other locations, I can do so. You know, time and time again, I come up against this content is not available in your location. I mean, I used to come up against that, but haven't in a while. Not since Nord. For example, you want to access content that's only available in Japan? Use NordVPN. But more importantly, don't want people tracing your location? You bet your bottom dollar you can't do any better than Nord. But it ain't just a VPN, a virtual private network. Nord doesn't only keep your location safe and secure by hiding your IP address with their more than 6,000 Nord servers around the world. Nord also has incredible features like Nord's Mesh Net, where you can safely connect to any other device in the world. Or how about a password manager, a data scanner, a dark web monitor that gives you alerts if your credentials have been leaked? Or how about Nord's threat protection that blocks nefarious websites and ads, it scans files, and it stops trackers in their tracks. Nord's goal is, and it's always been, to make the internet better than it is this very day. Free from online threats, free from surveillance, free from censorship. Ding, ding, ding in my book. The internet, who knows where this is going. You got people being shut down coast to coast. You got stalkers out there. You got some angry people, but Nord's got your back. So become safer with a click by downloading NordVPN today. And if you use my special link, that is nordvpn.com/thatchapter, you can get an exclusive deal. Love me some exclusive deals. Get a NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 extra months right here at nordvpn.com/thatchapter. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Nord, it's your all-in-one, keep you safe on the internet thing. So once again, go to nordvpn.com/thatchapter to get a 2-year plan and get 4 extra months, all with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, so you know you can trust them. Thank you so much to Nord for supporting That Chapter. Now let's get back to this horrifying story. The very next day, which was Saturday, March 22nd, 2014, as Lanre's friends and colleagues and his family were going around Ibadan looking for him, another Okada boy from Ibadan got a call from Lanry. But this call immediately sent chills down their spine. He was utterly distraught, crying, pleading down the end of the line. He managed to calm himself enough to say that he had been kidnapped. He was being held with like almost a dozen others in some location. He didn't exactly know where it was, but he said he was being held with these other folk underground. He said it was pitch black down there. He could barely see anything, and this was not good. See, Lanray had been kidnapped, and he'd been searched by his captors, and they had found his phone and taken it away. But Lanray, being an Okada boy, needing a phone constantly to do routes and do rides, and there's not exactly a phone charger on his little bike taxi, Lanray had a second phone. But after his captors found the first one, they didn't bother to check if he had a backup cell phone. So that's how he was thankfully able to make the call to his friends, please rescue me. So Lanray told his friends he was being held in a basement or some kind of like underground shelter type thing, and there was others here too, and the others looked like they had been held here for quite a long time. Some of them were missing limbs, even many of them were just malnourished. They looked like they'd been starved for weeks. Lanray didn't know what exactly was happening, but he did know that he only had a limited amount of time before his captors came back for him. He was also against the clock here because his cell phone, the battery was dying. Fortunately, if there was one thing an Okada was good at, that is remembering a route. So Lanray was actually able to give his colleagues, the other Okada boys, very specific directions to where he believed he'd been taken to. He had been dragged into some kind of other vehicle, but out the windows he could see specific landmarks. So he had a kind of like a vague idea of where exactly he was being held. He said this was in an area that included a lot of dilapidated and abandoned factories and structures on the edge of town. Using his instructions on the march through these abandoned industrial areas and jungles, his friends, numbering in the dozens at this stage, were able to find the exact location he had described. He had led them to an area called the Soka Forest, which is on the southern end of the city. So they were all marching through this forest, determined to rescue their buddy. But up ahead, in a clearing, they could see what looked like some kind of structure in the forest. It probably had once been a factory, but now it was a little more than rubble. Some walls had collapsed, all the windows had been blown out, parts of the roof were caved in. And just as these Okada boys finally believed they found where their friend was being held, they saw a man standing out front. A man armed with a firearm. And upon seeing the Okada boys approaching this building, this guy with a gun opened up on him. Immediately opened up on him. Shit was getting real. Whatever was happening in this nightmare factory, folks, no messing around. No messing around here. This story sounds so unbelievable, and it gets so unbelievably horrific. This is all a true story. So obviously the Okadas were forced to retreat, but they wouldn't be gone for long. The Okadas just left to increase their numbers, get more of the lads around, and to arm themselves with whatever they could. I don't even think the weapons were like terribly important to them at this stage. Their plan was just to overwhelm whoever was in this abandoned factory with sheer numbers. That's how determined these Okada boys were. They were determined to storm this place. It didn't matter how many people were there, how many people had firearms and rifles. They were going, that's a tight-knit group. They brought knives, machetes, baseball bats. One even brought a pair of bolt cutters, which they were going to use to bludgeon whoever stood in their way. But those bolt cutters would come in handy for another reason, that's for sure. So having prepared themselves for a fight, possibly to the death, you can like imagine the adrenaline that would have been pumping through each one of those Okada boys as they walked through these abandoned industrial areas, these dilapidated buildings, through a jungle to get to where their friend had been. They were ready. This could end horribly. But when they arrived to the Soka Forest, they seen the building in the clearing up ahead. It was quiet. This time it was eerily quiet. There was no signs of any armed guards, gunmen around here at all. They had fled. Whoever they were clearly knew that they had been rumbled, and the Okadas would be back and back in numbers. That's not to say they didn't find anyone though. Far from it. As they approached the spot where, they'd been forced to turn back earlier because of the guy with the firearm, instead of finding some kind of armed security, they instead found a group of terrified people, bound with chains on their hands, on their legs, begging to be rescued. they immediately called the police. And so while some of the group stayed with these poor people who were chained up inside, others went deeper into this abandoned factory to see what they could see. Those bolt cutters did come in handy after all. And as the boys waited on the police, they made another truly horrifying discovery. In an outbuilding, like all the area, semi-built and almost falling to pieces, they came across a room that resembled the lost baggage claim of an international airport. It wasn't the only one. Room after room had these floors almost entirely covered with a variety of mismatched personal items. Wallets, purses, coats, even entire suitcases. Literally thousands of them. Tens of thousands. A lot of people, it looked like thousands of people, had come through this place. But why? What were those gunmen so eager to protect that they literally shot on sight? And the mystery of who these items belonged to, it would and it wouldn't remain a mystery for too long. It would remain a mystery in that their identities maybe will never be known, but why they were there, well, that would be answered pretty quickly. Outside, the confusion of the first discovery was trumped by an even more grim one. To go with the graveyard of personal possessions, beginning in the forest right outside the door, was a literal graveyard. A boneyard, to be more accurate. Whole skeletons, skull after skull, femur, tibia, fibula. There was no way to count or even begin to guess at how many people had been discarded here outside the abandoned factory. These bones stretched from right outside the door of the factory further and further and further into the forest, where they would end up seeing barbed wire. This whole area had been enclosed with a ring of barbed wire. By the time the police arrived, several of those people who had been rescued immediately just booked it out of there. They did not want to hang around. They'd been something through something so horrific they didn't even want medical care. They just wanted to leave, and they would vanish, never to be found. Of the remaining 7 survivors who actually stayed waiting for the police arrived, one was in such poor physical condition he dropped dead before the police could even get there to give them help. So that left 6 people, and all of them were taken then to the nearest hospital for medical treatment. The authorities then cordoned off the area, trying then to calm down this furious mob who were, as you can imagine, losing their shit about how this had been allowed to happen and the police inaction, which seemingly led to it. Though the area in Soka Forest was quite far from the main built-up parts of the city itself, it wasn't entirely isolated. Within shouting or screaming distance of what was already being called the Ibadan House of Horrors were several private homes that first became the target of the investigation by the police and by the community. Simply put, no one could quite kind of figure out how a slaughterhouse on an industrial scale had been able to operate out here just on the edge of town without nobody knowing anything. And so when, people who lived nearby were questioned about, like, how did you not report this? Like, what was going on? How did you miss this? The nearby locals were like, actually, we had a fair idea something was going on for quite a long time. We had seen, like, strange people coming and going at odd hours. A black SUV would come and go all the time. Not only that, they'd heard screaming. They'd seen strange lights in the forest. They'd seen fires deeper into those woods. They'd heard chanting. They'd heard noises they wouldn't ever want to hear again. And these locals living near the Soka forest, they had reported this to the police. They reported many times, and there's something very creepy and scary going on in these woods. And, well, the same thing happened when the Okada boys started disappearing. Nothing at all. One of the most concerning things is that these locals who lived near this murder factory, this ritual killing factory, they reported that they seen a black SUV coming and going at all hours, and they would see some smartly dressed man driving it. He had been coming and going for about 10 years. That's how long this slaughterhouse had been active for. He was probably bringing new victims every single time. And so despite these numerous police reports that were made about something going on, something suspicious, no investigation ever actually kind of like spiraled up to, go out and take a look at what was there. As news broke of the Soka forest discovery, outrage spread among the locals of Ibadan and right across Nigeria, with everyone asking the same question. Who or what was behind the slaughterhouse in Soka forest?
It's terrible. Honestly, it's terrible. It's so painful. The only suggestion I have for this government is this. Except there is community policing, permissible community policing, this kind of thing cannot stop.
How the activities of the ritualists had gone unnoticed beats the imagination, especially given that a residential building is just a spitting distance away.
Why were, well, I mean, we can hazard a guess from the boneyard, from the items that were discovered, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people being taken to the slaughterhouse and murdered there. And the answer, speaking to items they found there and speaking to some of the survivors, was they were being taken there to be ritualistically sacrificed. This was ritualistic serial killing happening here. The people who ran this whole place would kidnap anyone they could off the street, rich or poor, it did not matter, take them here in that blacked out SUV and ritualistically dismember them right there. Despite the very vocal outcry from locals that was echoed around the country, there's never been a solid suspect or suspects named. In fact, it's doubtful whether there's ever really been an investigation at all. Don't ask, don't tell. A leading theory about why the government didn't want to investigate the Ibadan Forest of Horrors, well, it was because they were in on it. That's why. People were going missing in the city of Ibadan and the police didn't care. That's why people were reporting it. Hey, I'm hearing screaming, chanting, strange lights, fires coming from this place in the middle of nowhere, these abandoned factories. And the police were like, great, I don't care. That this was state-sanctioned ritualistic killing, sacrifices to something.
This case is going to be investigated thoroughly, and whoever is found wanting will certainly go to court for prosecution. But all I'm assuring the people, we should not take the law into our own hands. Nobody knows who did this, and let the police do their job, investigate it, and then whoever is responsible, take him to court for prosecution and possible jail.
See, when the horrific situation was uncovered, rather than cordoning off the site, limiting access to only the most necessary of investigators, and bringing in the best forensics teams from around the country, instead, no, would they do any of that? You know what you would think. No, they went ahead and just bulldozed the entire building. They buried this entire place. Authorities decided that instead of trying to preserve some maybe vital evidence here of some really sinister and sadistic murders happening, no. Listen, how about we just kind of bury it all? Let's knock the whole thing down and just forget about it. The government claimed that they were working to locate those still missing, which was a lot of people. But the community and those who went directly to the site of the massacre said no work was being done there. Some said that, the government had brought in, excavators and that sort of thing, in response to the reports of Lanray calling from some underground bunker, that they were going to dig up and look for any tunnels or, basements or whatever. But no, when locals would go, they would see that they were just there, rusting. And so when they were searching around this place, they couldn't find any underground bunker, though, when the locals, the Okada boys, were looking for their friends. They seen these excavators there, sitting there, doing nothing. They went back, as the Okada boys are going to do, look out for their own. They went back, they got shovels, they got everything they could. They started digging, trying to find their brother, who had been calling from some underground bunker. They dug. They didn't find anything. They searched the Soka forest for any sign of an underground structure, but they never found anything. He said he had been taken here, but they never found where he said he'd been taken to. So that kind of led searchers to believe that Lanray may have been taken to a second location. Yeah, another location, but we will get to that in a second. 2 days after the discovery of the Soka Forest Boneyard, the apparent inaction had caused enough outrage that it became only a matter of time before the anger and frustration overflowed into a response and ultimately violent action. The locals were very pissed off that this had been allowed to happen. Local government representatives tried their best to call for calm, but they were ill-equipped for the intensity of the horrific situation. The Soka site fell into total chaos as the community stormed across the area, turning the buildings over and searching for hidden chambers that had begun as the subject of rumors, but were now being taken as proven facts by the public. Word of the horrors at Soka and the number of victims had spread across the country instantly, and as a result, hundreds of people had poured in from across Nigeria. anyone with a missing friend or a missing relative from any part of Nigeria or even the surrounding countries came here to the forest in Ibadan, hoping and praying that maybe this is where they'd been taken. They looked through this whole area, they looked through the bones, more importantly they looked through any of the possessions that had been left behind, of which there were thousands upon thousands. This eventually did lead to rioting. 20 people were injured, several of them seriously, and so that's when the government said, we're just gonna bulldoze this entire thing and move on with our lives. So there was rumors upon rumors about what had been happening here. One of the most shocking rumors is that this is where the local government had been keeping so-called lunatics here. That this was some improvised lunatic asylum. They would regularly do these like street sweeps, or I guess whatever you want to call it. You know, like we need to clean up the town. So they would just, any, you know, homeless people they found, anybody basically who didn't look like they should be there, in you get, out you get here. That was one rumor about, you know, what had been happening here. Though in fairness now, that was pretty unlikely to be true because of what the survivors said. This wasn't just some like improvised asylum. There was some ritualistic stuff happening here.
Some motorcyclists, having lost contact with a colleague, formed a search party which discovered this den. The news making the rounds indicates that this place was a haven for mentally deranged individuals. The reality is, however, different. The scenario is obvious. For these ones, this is an easy way to make extra naira. Perpetrators of these inhuman acts had been in business for a long time. Human parts littered the area, prepared for potential buyers.
The survivors told of what they'd seen and what had been done to them in this place, and they spoke of these rituals. They would sacrifice people, they would sacrifice limbs, whatever limbs they could, you know. They would sell these to people looking to get, you know, good fortune, good luck, power, long life, whatever it was. They would make these medicines out of these sacrificed people, and well, I'm not sure if it works, but I don't think it's worth it if it does. So in this black SUV, they would just drive around the city, kidnap, reef them off the street, throw them into the back of the SUV and take them here. Take them to the Forest of Horrors. They would put them in these cages, chain them up, and then from there use them like cattle, whatever was required. They would, you know, view the stock of, they would have dozens and dozens of people in these cages. They'd look for an arm here, a leg there, genitals there, a head here. Unchain them, take them out of the cage, and bring them to the altar. An altar was found in this place with little runoffs along either side, runoffs for the blood. And then at the altar, the machete would come out. After they got what they needed, it was either back to the cage, if they thought you had a good chance, or instead it was just no cage necessary, the machete gets used again. And you know what, I don't know if this story can get any stranger, but this is, let me read you a section of one report I found on the Ibadan Forest of Horrors. A policeman who spoke on the condition of anonymity told our correspondent that a crocodile was killed near one of the containers. He said it was possible that the killers kept it there and fed it with the flesh of their victims while they threw away the bones after removing the organs they needed from their bodies. After they got what they needed from you, it was either back to the cage where they maybe will reuse you again, or feed you to their pet crocodile. This is like Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom level shite. But this was a horrifying reality, and this was not, folks, something that just like suddenly appeared. This is something that had been happening since time immemorial, where people would sacrifice, people would do these rituals to something, and it didn't just happen in Nigeria neither. A famous case occurred in 2001 in London when a passerby was walking along Tower Bridge, downtown London, and they saw, floating along the Thames River, well, what he at first thought was a mannequin. As it floated, though, closer and closer on the river, he realized, this ain't no mannequin. He called the police and they retrieved the remains from the Thames. It was quite simply a torso. It was the body of a boy who they would determine had been in the water for maybe 10 days. Missing were the arms, the legs, and the head. All had been what was described as expertly amputated. This was quickly deemed to have been done as part of some ritual that a young boy had been dismembered. Medical examiners could tell the boy, up until his gruesome death, had been healthy, had been fed well, but that was it. The only thing they had to go on was a pair of orange shorts that the remains had been wearing, and then investigating those shorts, it was found that they were only sold in a selection of stores in Germany. Like, they weren't anyone you'd get anywhere. They weren't like Nike shorts or anything like that.
Police say the body recovered was of a boy aged around 5.5 years old and of Afro-Caribbean descent. He was wearing orange shorts with a Kids and Company logo and washing instructions in German.
It's just over a year since the torso of a young Afro-Caribbean boy was discovered in the Thames. Police named him Adam, and last Saturday they placed a wreath in the river at the spot where his body was found. His limbs and head had been severed, and thanks to information from Crime Watch viewers in our last appeal, police are now sure it was a ritual killing. During the investigation, Met Police travelled to South Africa to meet a shaman, a kind of witch doctor, and no less a person than Nelson Mandela appealed for public help.
If anywhere, even in the remotest village of our continent, there is a family missing a son of that age, please contact the police in London.
When the medical examiner looked through Adam's stomach, they found a couple of unusual things in there. Well, first of all, they could tell that he'd only been in England for a couple of days. They could tell this by the amount of pollen that was found in his gut. But second of all, his last meal was another thing that led them to the belief that this had been some kind of ritual. They found African clay in there. Round bone, ash, gold, and quartz were also all found in his stomach. And worse than even that was that he had recently been fed 2 plants before all this. One of the plants he was fed was a hallucinogen. The second plant he had been fed was what's called the Doomsday plant. It's called the Doomsday plant because when you ingest it, you're paralyzed, but you can still feel everything that's done to you. About a year later, all the way up in Glasgow, Scotland, a social worker became worried about 2 young girls she was keeping an eye on. She was concerned for their safety with the woman they lived with. Name of Joyce Osagieri. When workers showed up at Joyce's home, they found some very strange things inside once again. Ritualistic stuff, objects, linked to voodoo and such. And they also found in her home, what did they find? Another pair specifically of those orange shorts that were only sold in a few stores, select stores in Germany.
When the headless torso of a young black boy was pulled from the River Thames late last year, police here realised they were entering new territory. That territory being the ritual killing of children in religious ceremonies with their roots in Africa. Today, police from all over Europe gathered to discuss what they believe to be an alarming rise of child sacrifice across the continent.
Joyce was soon arrested and claimed to know nothing about Adam, the boy's remains that were found in London. Tracing contacts she had, this led to more people in London who were involved in ritualistic murders. They found videotapes showing them being done. They found animal skulls, liquid potions, and some scary stuff. It seemed clear that there was human trafficking and murders going on, but they never found anything hard linking them to the body found in the Thames, so no arrests were made. All the people in this case were linked with human trafficking from Nigeria to the UK, linked to ritualistic murders, but they didn't have anything hard, that would hold them in court. So eventually all were deported back to Nigeria, which is where they're from, specifically southwestern Nigeria, which is where they would determine Adam was originally from too, right around the area of Ibadan. It's a fact that despite Nigeria being at the forefront of the continent's technological evolution, it's still a country of ancient tradition. And while most of them are harmless and even beneficial to the people and communities involved, there are those who keep some of the darker traditions alive. Overall, Nigeria is a fairly religious country, about 54 to 46% Muslim to Christian. In the very south though, around Ibadan, more traditional religions still hold strong. A lot of these killings are done for pay, with the idea being that, somebody's buying the body parts or organs for wealth, be that physical, spiritual, or financial. Tragically, due to the widening of the wealth gap in Nigeria, ritual killings, they're only on the up and up. In 2022, Nigeria's House of Representatives urged the Nigerian federal government to declare a state of emergency due to the rising incidence of ritual killings in the country. This was after a huge outcry when a teen girl was murdered by her boyfriend and 3 of his friends who They killed her, they burned her head, and they planned on using the ashes in a money-making ritual before they were apprehended. People were absolutely outraged, of course, as you can imagine when this happened. And another outrage was, get a load of this, a politician, presumably desperate, absolutely desperate to win in the next election, he paid $1,000 for a handkerchief soaked in the blood of a murdered person, if you can believe that. There have been known to be surges in ritual killings around election times. Some also believe that the Nigerian film industry, known as Nollywood, glorifies these acts in movies, which, quote, some of our youths seem stuck in the mistaken belief that sacrificing human blood is the surest route to wealth, safety, and protection, end quote. This has actually gotten to the extent that depictions of such have been banned by the government in the spring of 2024. And it's sort of becoming a taboo subject in many places of Nigeria. They will refuse to talk about this kind of thing. They don't want it brought up. As you can imagine, it's pretty horrifying. One document I've seen a few times was a report of a survivor of the Soka House of Horrors. She gave an account of what had happened to her. She said she was just sitting out on her porch one day of her house. She was a wealthy, upper class woman, right? So she would be missed. Police would investigate if something happened to her, but she said she was sitting there, minding her own business on her day off when the black SUV pulled up right outside her house, and a smartly dressed man got out of the car and said he was with the police. She had to come with him. Now, apparently he did flash some kind of identification. Obviously it was bullshit, but she was like, okay, fine, I'll go with you. When she got in the blacked out SUV, she quickly realized he was not police, and they were not going to the police station because they began driving in the opposite direction to the Soka House of Horrors. One of the main things about this account, though, is it didn't happen in Ibadan. It happened in another city. So that meant that the victims of the Forest of Horrors weren't, just like homeless people and the less dead, as they're frequently called. There were people from all walks of life from all around Nigeria. So the victims could be anybody, but whoever had done this could be anybody, and because they were doing it so blatantly, they would just take whoever they wanted in the bright light of day. It seemed just so brazen who they were. They clearly felt like they were above the law. That was again what led people to believe, how could the police have not known this was happening? That there was some kind of government level involvement in these murders. Something else that came from the accusations of a conspiracy was the idea of a vast network of such torture chambers. While Soka was the biggest, it was not the only slaughterhouse discovered. Less than 2 weeks after the discovery of the slaughterhouse in Soka, another house of horrors was discovered in a city called Abeokuta, which is pretty close, only southwest of Ibadan. This house was dubbed a baby factory, with 5 infants and 3 women, all pregnant, being rescued from the building. A heavily pregnant woman had managed to free herself and flee the area, alerting the authorities. When locals and police responded and attempted to arrest the gang leader thought to be responsible, he managed to flee the scene despite being shot multiple times. Like the Soka house, police found a bunch of personal belongings, including ID cards and documents of missing people, not present among the rescued victims. There was also a substantial amount of blood and signs of many births having happened. It didn't take long for rumors to begin of the babies being taken away and either sold on or used in rituals. One woman rescued from the house told interviewers that herself and her child had been sold to the operators of the house for the equivalent of $60. Outraged locals attempted to storm the building and even tried to set it on fire, but police cleared them out. Many Nigerians believe that the two sites are linked and may even be a part of an organized and complex network, likely run by gangs that have infiltrated the government, or more scarily, the other way around. And Lanre Sedeku, the man who alerted, the Okada boys and then, eventually the police about what was happening, about where this was, he's never been found. The man who, used the last battery to call for help. No one knows where he is. No one knows where that underground bunker that he was being held in with, he said, like about a dozen other people. That's never been found. That raised the possibility that either A, it was in Soka, but when the government decided to destroy this entire factory, essentially they were buried alive in it because the government, didn't keep it open, didn't keep it active, didn't want to investigate too hard. They just bulldozed it, and, you know, there still is an underground bunker out there that they just never discovered. Or the other option is there are even more of these places around the country. And as for arrests regarding the Ibadan Forest of Horrors building, well, they did actually make several, but ultimately no charges were brought, and the people that were arrested were only very low level. I did see some mentions that the man who drove the black SUV that he may have been arrested, but I could never find any reports that he was. I think he got away to continue what he was doing. So unfortunately, they only arrested some very low-level people who weren't wise enough to absolutely book it as soon as this factory of horrors was discovered. Police determined that there wasn't enough to charge these. These were probably like the armed gunmen who were outside in the perimeter, not actually involved in the rituals themselves. But police, well, when they didn't charge them, that was like, well, that's, you know, mighty suspicious in its own right. Why didn't you charge them with stuff? Why couldn't you get more names from them to go up the food chain of whoever was actually ultimately responsible for all of this? Simply the scale of what was going on in the Ibadan Forest of Horrors, lads. There's no way nobody could have known nothing about what was happening there. Somebody must have had, an inkling that there was this kind of like terrifying stuff happening out there, and it could happen to anybody, and it was let to happen. So whether the government, local government was involved or no, likely we'll never get an answer to that one. And ritualistic killings still happen to this day, and it is terrifying. Most recently, in August of 2024, in Ibadan, residents of this one community, well, they noticed a horrifying smell coming from one apartment building. They'd seen strange people coming and going at odd hours. They called the police. The police come in, bust in the door. They find dozens and dozens of, once again, mutilated remains inside these buildings. Authorities would later learn that just a few months prior, this is amongst the dozens of victims, a 28-year-old man had been lured there, killed for his head and legs, which were later sold. And about a week before this place was found, in early August of 2024, a 17-year-old boy had been lured there, again murdered for his head and his legs, which were sold to a woman for $40. So this is still happening to this day. How many more murder factories are out there and operating, not just in Nigeria, but around the world? And finally, for the main site we've been talking about in Ibadan, Forest of Horrors, it has been repurposed since authorities decided to just drive over it with bulldozers and destroy the entire place. So what's it been repurposed for? I hear you're barking, big dog. Maybe a memorial to the hundreds upon hundreds, maybe more, people who were horrifically murdered, tortured to death here. Maybe a memorial to, the lives lost. Maybe a peaceful forest, let nature take its course. Garden of remembrance, perchance? Nope, news started to come out that a school was going to be built on the site. And when reports started coming out, I hear they're going to build a school where the slaughterhouse, the human ritual slaughterhouse was. This is like some Lovecraft style stuff. Government were like, no, we're not building a school there. You must be joking. Can't build a school there. They did build a school there. Shinee. Thank you so much for watching, folks. It really means the absolute world that you're here watching this whole video with me. I hope you found it as, horrifying, but I guess interesting, shocking, as I did. It's quite the story. As always, a new video is out every Tuesday, but if you're looking for more That Chapter, you can check out the That Chapter Patreon, where there's early access ad-free versions of every video, plus there's a whole playlist of Patreon-only videos. There's a Patreon-only Discord, so you can check that out. Also, please check out the That Chapter podcast, which releases a brand new episode every Monday morning. You can check it out on all podcast platforms. It's absolutely free, or you can check it out on YouTube, where some more video stuff will be posted in the upcoming time. But until the next whole video, please take care of each other, and please take care of your bad self, because I love you. Mike out.